Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a weekly show that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, check out the blog, www.majorionbowie.com, for new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And today, I'm really excited to be joined by two very special guests who I'm going to go out on a limb and say most subscribers to this show already know. Greg Miller and Kristianne Huntsberger, the hosts of the very popular Bowie Book Club podcast. Kristianne and Greg have had a book club going since before 2016, but upon the death of David Bowie, they took on the very formidable task of structuring their book club around a list of 100 books that Bowie himself published in 2013. Thus, the Bowie Book Club was born. Many years later, Kristianne and Greg have made it through all 100 of Bowie's books, but the book club continues with selections of additional books that they knew that he either read, or they suspected he read, or they thought he should have read. And I'm going to ask them about that. The monthly episodes are anticipated eagerly by both book lovers and people with an interest in Bowie. And you don't need to be both. You could be one or the other to really enjoy their show. So if you're one of the many fans of their show, you're in it for a treat today. And if by some chance you're watching this and you don't know their show, the first thing you're going to want to do after you're done listening to this interview is subscribe to their show, because it's a real treat. It's something that I've come to look forward to on a monthly basis. So Kristianne and Greg, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Hello.
Oh, thank you. You are too generous.
And you have a great intro. Like, we stumble over our intro every time, and you got it down. Nice.
Well, you know, I've been practicing it now, so I thank you very much. And I have to say, now I know what you look like.
Yeah.
Which I'm very sorry about that from my end.
So let me ask you this. And fans of your show here, you do a very brief recap of the history of your show every single episode. But I like to ask guests, how do you describe your own work? I sort of painted a very broad overview, but in your own words, what is the Bowie Book Club all about?
Well, it's funny you say, like, you know, in our intro, we say we've had a book club for over a decade. But of course, like, we've been doing this now for almost a decade. So
right, yeah.
Kind of abbreviating the history a bit, but over a decade. We're a two-person book club. We're friends. We liked to read books. And I think we started, Greg, just reading books that we had intended to read and never gotten around to.
Yeah, I think it was basically the book club formed around me bothering Kristianne to read Ulysses.
Oh,
and
that
saying,
was
like, you have to read this. Why haven't you read this?
Yeah.
So she's like, okay, fine, I'll read it. If you buy me beer, I'll read it. And that's how it started.
Yeah. So we went through a number of, like, trades, you know, like, you got to read Moby Dick. He told me I got to read Ulysses. And then we just started picking things that we both had intended to read at some point.
Yeah.
But we would stretch a book on for months because we mostly just gossiped.
Right. It took us like 6 months to read The Savage Detectives, like, or at least most of a summer, because it was mostly about gossiping about other stuff. It was very unfocused at first.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, I was just saying it was very unfocused at first. You know, it really was more about the gossip. Like, we're not kidding about that part.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because you spend an episode talking about one book, and then at the end you say, well, what else are you reading? And it seems like you're knocking off like 5 or 6 books every month.
And that's a lot of the gossip.
And I tend to mostly read comic books and very short books, so I'm padding the statistics a little bit there.
Yeah.
Not true. Bleak House.
Oh yeah, except for Bleak House. I do have a soft spot for Dickens.
Yeah, well, I'll also say to people watching this, just before we started taping, Greg was talking about how he read the entire Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson series, which happened to be behind me, and they're not brief books.
Yeah.
So
it took me like 5 years though.
So you cover a lot of books. You're interested in even the books that you've mentioned cover a broad range, which is actually surprisingly characteristic of Bowie's list of 100. And I often find when I'm listening to your show that I almost forget that there's a Bowie connection at all as you're talking about the books that you're reading, yet you always bring it back. And I wonder, is that an intentional design, or is it just how it plays out?
Intentional over practice. I think when we first started, we came up with kind of a rough sketch of like we wanted like I am a music person, but Greg is the big music person. I'm more like heavily a book person. So I was really drawn to the list because of how weird the list was.
Yeah.
And so I think we really wanted it to be about the books and always keeping the anchor in Bowie, which is why we come back to it and just trying to frame it like, why is this? You know, in this whole pantheon of Bowie's world, where does this fit?
Yeah.
But really wanting to have the books shine.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why, I was thinking that, you really don't need to be a fan of David Bowie to like the show. And I'll tell you, I mean, I don't, I don't know how this is going to strike you, but I thought of the car talk, right? You don't need to know, or really be interested in cars to like listening to that show. So, that show's over. So your show is The Inheritor.
Man, Greg, can we put that on our promo material? Like,
yeah, I think we're going to cut
books.
that out.
Car talk for books, yes. So what's the story behind his list? He released it in 2013, and what do you know about why he released it, and what relationship he had to the books that were on the list?
So I think the sort of genesis of the list, there's sort of like the factual part of it, and then there's the speculative part of it, and we definitely indulge in the speculative part of it. But I think the factual part of it is that it was part of an exhibit that kind of went around the world. I think it started at the British Museum or a museum in England, where it was an exhibit of his costumes and like his guitars, and sort of like ephemera about him. And one of the exhibits was like a trunk of books, and from that, like either he or someone wrote down like, here are the books in the trunk or in the display, and that was published as his list of 100 most influential books, and that started kind of circulating on the internet.
Yeah.
But the speculative part of it, and the thing that we keep coming back to, is that it's really hard. I mean, Kristianne has her like crazy wall string chart of how the books connect, but sometimes it's really hard to figure out like, well, why did he read this one?
Yeah.
And how does this connect to the other books on the list? Like, there's definitely some that are much easier to kind of place in his life, but then there are some where you're like, I don't get why this is here.
Yeah.
So one theory is that it just happened to be the books on his bookshelf. He told his personal assistant, put these in the trunk and mail them to England, and it kind of just the myth grew from there. But we can't say for sure.
Yeah. Do you, other than that, and the obvious that they're connected to Bowie, do you have a unifying theory?
Oh, I do.
Yeah. Take it away.
I'm intrigued by the description of the big chart on the wall with the strings.
Yeah. It's actually, I mean, it's a chart on the wall in a way, but it's also like on this tablet. It is really a chart. It does exist. We're not messing around.
Nice.
The joke is that the center book there is Teenage by John Savage.
Yeah.
When we read that book, which was, I just was looking at my old school notebooks.
A couple years ago now.
Oh, I mean, everything is a couple years
ago.
Yeah. We really were like, hey, this is sort of connected to every other book we've read on the list because it's about teenagehood and youth culture and there were so many other threads, and we were like, let's just throw that in the center and then just start creating a yarn chart off of that. But more than that, there were just these sections, like in this group we have the literary kind of fiction, or not fiction, but like literary criticism books. And then there was like the comic books, and there was the Germany books and the Russia books and the what we call the boring boy books, which were all these kind of, you could call them unreliable narrators. They're also just kind of dislikable narrators who have really interesting people around them. And that was a huge part of this chart. that crosses over with other things. There's a poetry section, there's like being Black in America section, there's the music books. So we kind of have these bubbles, and a lot of them intersect with each other, but ultimately they all come down to teenage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. So do you subscribe to the idea that they were actually influential on him? I mean, obviously some of them were like, 1984 and Clockwork Orange are on the list, but there's others that, like you were saying, you couldn't figure out why they're on the list at all. And not something that I noticed was there's a handful of books that had been released fairly recently compared to when he published his list. So it's like, how influential could they have been if they had only been released a few years earlier?
Yeah, out of interest, which
Yeah.
books do you think don't fit on the list off the top of your head?
Well, I'll tell you the one that jumped out, and if you indulge me with a story, I want to hear from you, but I'll tell you the story. So I had forgotten that The Age of American Unreason by Susan Jacoby was on the list, which was published initially in 2008, and he did the list in 2013. So if he was suggesting that book was influential on his songwriting, the only album it could have possibly influenced was The Next Day, which came out in 2013. And my mind starts going into crazy directions because that album has songs on it that are related to politics. There's one song that has this line about "I'll burn all your books" and the problems that they make. "If I Can See You" is the song. And was that fresh in his mind, or like you said, was the book just on his shelf? But just my side story is this: I was recently teaching a class at SUNY Albany, and a student asked me for a list of books, and I had that on the list, and I had forgotten that it was on Bowie's list. And but why am I telling you this long story? Because it's like, really, at the end of the day, it's, why was that on his list? That's you asked for examples, and I gave you an example, but why don't I've been talking too long. Why don't you take it from there?
So it's interesting what you said. So we've always really emphasized this list is not his favorite books, but
Yeah.
books that he said were influential.
Yeah.
And you specified influential to his songwriting, which is interesting because I've always just assumed that they were just influential to him. Like
Wow. Yeah.
when he thinks back on childhood, he's like, oh, Beano, I used to read Beano. That was really, it had a part of my childhood, or something like On the Road. I read this because my stepbrother really loved the Beats and introduced me to them, and it was influential to creating the person I became, or the persons
Yeah.
I became. And whether or not I think it's a good book now,
Yeah.
it was really motivational in some part of my life. So that's kind of how I've taken the list.
Yeah. Can I throw out a couple others that I thought were sort of odd inclusions?
Yeah.
So, like The Trial of Henry Kissinger, right? It's
I
like,
knew you were going to bring that up.
Man, there's some of the books that I don't remember reading.
Yeah. I was thinking about this last night because, I was kind of going through the list of questions again. And I started thinking, and I think this kind of ties to the closing of the American mind too, of like, he sort of had like a lifelong study of America, and it does kind of go back to his teenage years of like this idea of America as this sort of like mythical place, where all these records come from and all this culture and all this like really amazing stuff. And over time, and this is speculation, of course, is that his view of America and America's politics sort of narrows and changes. And the Henry Kissinger book is part of that too. Like, oh, okay, I've seen, oppression in fictional stuff like 1984 and all the books I've read about Russia and fascist Germany. And here's an example of it in America, in the American context. So it's influential on how he thinks about his adopted country in a way. So maybe it doesn't tie directly to a song, but like Kristianne says, it ties directly into how he thinks, which may kind of leak into songs,
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you said the closing of the American Mind. The book on the list is The Age of American Unreason.
Sorry. Yep.
But
I knew I was going to get that.
the closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, right?
Right.
He writes a description of the embodiment of the decline of Western civilization, and he describes Mick Jagger, but he describes him in a way that he's not describing Mick Jagger, he's describing David Bowie.
Oh, wow.
And it's like,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, the reason that that sort of slip of the tongue sort of jumped out at me because, the Susan Jacoby book is about it's less targeted at somebody like David Bowie.
Right.
But so part of the question is, turning that into a question is, even though Bowie himself was this consumer of literature, did his output actually contribute to a decline of intellectualism?
Mm.
A lot of flashy lights, short songs, video games, ISPs, right? Was he part of the problem?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm gonna throw to Kristianne on that.
Well, I don't want to point fingers. I think he was aware of being part of that. There's a lot of his kind of self-awareness of the role of the rock star, and um there's some way where it's like, I'm not making this, I'm feeding something that people already want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't cast aspersions at him for being. I think that of course he was playing into a system that was already on the roll in one particular direction. But if you're a creative person who's like inspiring people in other ways as well, it's not like he was making. There were some times when it was kind of candy pop points in his
Yeah.
oeuvre, but there was also like really inventive. I mean, the fact that the song we were just doing "The Gift" by Nabokov,
Yeah.
and he starts his song quoting Nabokov,
Yeah.
a la "Before the Deluge" by Otto Friedrich, but it's this, like, he's putting literary references in, he's putting little gems in for people to explore more from. Like, I think that there is a little subversion to his own art, that he's trying to create something that can also inspire people to delve into other things. Sure, they can listen to the pop music on the radio, but they can also like explore more about what he's planting in there.
Yeah. Oh,
And
he plants these literary references. Sometimes I've been listening to songs for decades and then would discover what this line actually meant. But
yeah.
you just mentioned the most recent show, as of the taping of this interview that you did, The Gift. And could you just explain that connection, that you go through this book, which you think that he probably read, but not necessarily, and that you just sort of, Kristianne, you just sort of touched on that. Just explain what you're talking about.
Yeah. So, it's interesting when you had mentioned before that you were going to probably talk about the Susan Jacoby. And I went back to my notes, and that was actually the first episode that we talked about, hey, we should do this second season where we recommend books to Bowie. Like, if we could be, you mentioned the Kissinger. I knew a bookseller who used to sell books to Bowie in New York, and he always bought like military history books and stuff. So part of Kissinger's role in that list is probably Bowie was really into military history. But we were doing these episodes. The Jacoby episode was when we kind of thought, hey, what about if we could be his personal booksellers and say, like, I know you just want to read the military history, but what if you read this instead?
Yeah.
So we had thought at that episode, we wanted to suggest Foucault's Pendulum, which was like, instead of, this Trevor Ravencroft's, Spear of Destiny, you should read Foucault's Pendulum instead. And that was where the seed started. And so that's where we are now. Once we finished the list, we were like, there's a bunch of books that we know he read that didn't make it on this list. Why didn't they make it on the list? Or there's books that we really want him to have read, and why didn't he? Why didn't he read Ursula Le Guin? I wish he had read Ursula Le Guin.
Right.
But the gift, we found there's a blog that we reference all the time called Pushing Ahead of the Dame, Chris
Yeah.
O'Leary.
Yes.
It's
And
amazing.
he
Yeah.
had pointed out that the opening of this song, I'd Rather Be High,
Yeah.
directly quotes a scene from the end of The Gift. So we put it on the list. But of course, the question is, did he really read The Gift or did he read the passage? Because the book that's on his list is Before the Deluge by Otto Friedrich, which was
Yeah.
about Weimar era Germany, which was an excellent book that I never would have read had it not been for this list. And that's probably why that reference comes up, but we can also extend, like maybe he did read The Gift after he read the Otto Friedrich, and maybe it's this, snowball effect.
Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't planning to ask this, but do you think that when he plants like an Easter egg like that in a song, it's because he's giving us something to do, or does he just like the way the words came together?
Oh,
I, I think it can be a bit of both.
Yeah.
I imagine, and he was clear on some records. He's like, I need to make money. Like Let's Dance was like, I am going to make an incredibly popular record.
Yeah.
But I bet that there's Easter eggs in there that kind of have not the aspiration, but have deeper levels of meaning and have hints of other things. Because I think he enjoyed it himself. That
Yeah.
process of like, how is my reading going to emerge in these lyrics in ways that I don't even expect, especially when he's using something like the cut up method to derive his lyrics. He's like, where did this pop out from? Cool.
Yeah.
And okay, now we have to make this the sugariest pop song so we can get it on the air. So I
Yeah.
think it is a partially for himself, for his own interest, and also as like a clue for the listener, to find out more. Or I like to think that, again, all speculation, but that's the way I like to think about it.
I think well, let me ask you this, and then I'll tell you why I'm asking. Do you think that there's greater interest in Bowie now than there was when he came out with his list in say 2013, or if there was maybe a peak in interest because he came out with The Next Day or the David Bowie is exhibit, say 2012? Is there more interest in him now than say 2012?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah.
I I don't know if there's more interest. How do I think there's more interest in the books. I
Yeah.
think there's more interest in specific things because it's all we have left.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
we're sort of digging deep. I mean, look at how we're like, oh, we have this new release of a track that was never released before. And
Yeah.
like there's always this kind of excavatory effort once we don't have any more. Like he was so he would reinvent himself all the time. There was like, oh, what's the new? What's the new thing? What's the new Bowie?
Yeah.
And we don't have that anymore. So it's almost like we're going back and renewing interest in things and digging deeper into them because we don't have new things from him.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't have new things, but he did, like, what you're doing is he left us something to work with.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. A whole lot to work with, for
Yeah.
sure.
I smiled when you mentioned Foucault's pendulum, which I always pronounce wrong. Uh,
Me too.
I read it, and Umberto Eco is maybe my favorite writer of fiction. But
Oh, yeah.
yeah, the Name of the Rose is maybe my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
But
great book. Yeah.
so you have several episodes where you trash Dan Brown, and you're like, don't read the Da Vinci Code, read Foucault's Pendulum instead. So I thought that was funny.
Which, I mean, we especially talked about that during the Jacoby episode because it was so much about like, well, we talked about Jacoby's,
Yeah.
she said, people are going to call me an elitist. And I was like, yeah, there is that thing that like I worked as a bookseller for a long time. And I'm like, if you're going to read Dan Brown, read Dan Brown. That's, I would rather you read than
Yeah.
not read. But there's some other books that are better if you want some suggestions.
Yeah.
Right? Like read Hawksmoor instead. Like it's
Yeah,
just as
yeah.
creepy and it's better written. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned we've both mentioned Susan Jacoby, who is very much still alive, and I I was wondering if you've had any interaction with any of the living authors of the books that made his list.
Have we?
Yeah. Huh.
Not regarding not on the podcast. Like we haven't had anyone come in
No.
and like claim, you know, I think I might have gone to an event. Well, I worked with the bookstore when Camellia Paglia came through town, but
Oh, that's right.
we weren't
Yeah.
doing the podcast yet.
Yeah.
So like I work with and around books and authors. I think what is it, Rupert? I would say Rupert Everett, but it's not Rupert Everett. Who
The guy who
did
wrote The Insult.
The
What's his
Insult?
name?
Yeah, he had come out with a new book, and I went and saw him speak. Yeah, so there's a few, that have been around, but we haven't connected to them for the podcast.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted the books just to be the books and because it would be great to talk to Sarah Waters about Fingersmith and why she thinks it's
Yeah.
on the list or something, but we
But
can't
you,
assume that he
yeah.
did. I mean, he probably knew Fran Lebowitz. That's probably,
Yeah.
But
But
you never got a call saying you people know nothing about my literature.
Yeah, imagine like Don DeLillo calls us up and like, listen, I want a retraction. Totally wrong about White Noise.
yeah.
That's funny. So going back to something we were talking about earlier, some of the books that were on his list, there's a very obvious connection to at least his output, and I was reminded as I was reviewing some of your past episodes of another interview I did with a professor from the Berklee College of Music who taught a literature course on Bowie, and she assigned the Iliad, the Inferno, in 1984. And I wanted to ask you, assuming you know nothing about the course, what do you think that class would be about? And then if you were to design a course about Bowie based on books from his list, what would you pull from it and say were essential?
Iliad, Inferno, and 1984. I mean, hell? The music of hell?
I mean, I'm not. This isn't like a quiz question. It's like, it's like if you were to work with that like the connection to Bowie. I'm sorry.
So thinking of trying to create a class.
Yeah.
Part of me wants to do a class that is the absence of women on David Bowie's list.
Yeah.
That's just books he should have had.
And yeah, and it would be at least one of the Boring Boy books to point out how interesting the female characters are in most of them, whereas the male characters are not. And I mean, you could do like Nights at the Circus, the Angela Carter book, because that has the narrator is a boring boy, and Feathers is this amazing circus like performer, and they go through like the tundra in northern Russia in the train, and it's like these the women on the fringes, I think, in a lot of the stories on this list, whether they be the music books, which like some women showed up in like the soul music books, but not in most of the others. And I mean, that's part of the music industry, but
Right.
Bowie had things to say about that. But yeah, I think I would try to think of how many books can you do? 3? How many books do students read now?
Well, let me come back to that. But this particular class, it was 3. But you're designing it, so you could assign whatever you want.
A good one, or one that was that I really enjoyed, was the sort of Russian German books that it's a part of history that I didn't know anything about. But a book like Before the Deluge, like Kristianne said, or Coast to Utopia, or A People's Tragedy, like that, building a history course out of those books would be super interesting, you know. And I guess we'd have to condense it down into like a, you know, a tweet or a TikTok video for it to work. But you know, I'd love to take a course based on those books.
Yeah. You asked how many books do students read, and I mentioned that I recently taught a class, which it was the first class I've taught in 19 years.
Mm.
And one of the other professors said they don't read anymore.
Mm.
And I didn't take that to be literal. And then my experience was they don't read at all, including the assignment.
Wow.
Right. And it was shocking. And I'm listening to your show, which is just a celebration of reading. And the both of you obviously get so much pleasure out of the act of reading and talking about it. And how did we get here that you have access to this source of pleasure and knowledge and, just expansion of horizons, and so many of the people that we're interacting with just don't have access to that. It's not even an interest.
Yeah, I was just the Seattle Public Library and Seattle Arts and Lectures we're in Seattle. They do an yearly summer book bingo, and I was just at an event with Merlin Sheldrake, who did the Entangled Life about mitochondria, mushrooms, and they were handing out like summer bingo starting, and
Yeah.
the stats that they have on, like, they're really trying to encourage, like, they have like a teen bingo sheet now and a kids bingo sheet, and in their publicity material they're like, you don't even have to read like a full line, just read one book, and that they have all this stats about how few Americans read a single book in a year. And I was floored by that, just like, wait, how is that possible? But it is possible.
Yeah. Well,
I think part of it is, well, I was just thinking about this morning of how different things were when I was growing up, just in terms of like your access to information. Like to find out something, you had to go to the library and hope that there was a book available about it, and take the time to actually read to get to the thing you want.
Yeah.
And now it's so, everything is so available. And then I started thinking about how when I was growing up, I would carry a book around with me all the time.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was both as an escape to get away from whatever boring thing I didn't want to do, but also for the same kind of dopamine hit that you get from Twitter or from TikTok or from Facebook. And now that's just speeded up. You get those dopamine hits and you get that ability to escape from boring, stressful, whatever, so much easier. So why, when you don't have to go through all the steps of getting to a dopamine hit that we used to,
Right.
Why not just do TikTok? Why not just scroll on your phone? You have access to the thing that your reptile brain wants much quicker.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying, but I can kind of see the connection. Like, books to me are still that sort of sedative in a weird way, or maybe not so weird way that they were when I was younger. I just feel happier and sort of calmer when I'm reading.
Yeah. So how do you choose what to read next? And I ask that both in terms of the show, and also just, the end of the show where you say, what else are you reading?
So the show, we have a very scientific process for picking the books.
That has been tested year after year, and it only gets more accurate.
Yeah. So when we started talking about, hey, should we do this? Should we read through this list? This is a weird list. And we realized that we were going to pick the books we liked first, and we would have to slog through stuff at the end if we let ourselves pick. So we have the same list that we use like the whole time, and it's like tangled and mangled
it
from
looks really, really bad now.
it's like just like highlights and drawing and little notes on the side and color coded by the year that we read each book. So we would go to a bar and count things. So we would choose things in the space to count, and or like if there's a book on the shelf, we would just like open randomly to a page and page 84. Okay, so then we'd like mark 84. So we're gonna read Private Eye, the satirical magazine from the 60s and 80s. And yeah, so we would just pick for the year, pick 12 numbers. I find out what they were on the list, and those were our books for that year. And sometimes it was an amazing, like we had the German year where all the books about like the history of mostly Weimar era Germany on the list came up, or the music year where like a bunch of the music books came up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how we picked for that for the podcast.
And to be clear, there was still a lot of slogging at the end. We didn't get to escape that.
I was going to ask, did you ever read a book and feel like it was a waste of your time? So I will ask that, but also, were there any of these books that you just did not like reading?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
We've mentioned it a number of times, and I know it's like some people are just heartbroken, but I still just don't like Maldoror.
Nope, it did not work.
It was a long form surrealist poem, and it just felt like a whiny teenager who really liked like metal music, and I just
so it can expect a teenage.
Yeah, teenage.
I have to admit, I have never read it, but I did listen to your discussion of it, and probably never will read it as a result.
Good, we've done our job then.
It had like it's influential in its way. It was experimental, surrealist poetry, and I know that it lives in a canon somewhere. We also were kind of hard on Julian Jaynes' Bicameral Mind book, which is also like influential in the history of psychology. It was monumental in its time, since possibly proven untrue, but still holds a place of history. And it was just a really hard read.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, even though a book that we both liked, I think Piranesi by Suzanne Clark, I think was influenced by that book. And Piranesi was an incredible novel, but it didn't make Bicameral Mind any easier to get through.
Yeah. Well, I was somewhat surprised that I have not read Bicameral Mind, but I know that is a book that Bowie actually, that was not something that was just on his shelf. He would like recommend that book to people. That was for a reason. It was very meaningful to him.
Yeah, I think the ideas of it were really helpful, like Piranesi. Like it was really great to have the ideas. I struggled with the writing style and just it was big.
Yeah. And one book that the book that's top of mind for me, and it is kind of a bummer because I'd heard a lot about it and was wanting to look forward to, is Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby. And I'd heard it recommended a billion times, and man, I just couldn't get through it. I mean, I did, but I wanted it out of the house as soon as I finished it. It was such like just a cruel book, that it was difficult. That's the one that I'm like, I'm glad I never have to go back to that.
Wow. So I was going to ask you if you'd ever consider doing a book on the show about Bowie. And then I was looking at your website, and I say this not to you, but to anybody watching this. The website is great. I mean, there's a lot of resources on the website for the podcast. But I noticed that you have backstage passes on the list for this year. And I wanted to ask, of all the books about Bowie, why did you choose that one?
Well, we were trying to pick books that we think he would have read.
Yeah.
And, he probably struggled with reading or not reading that book, but he probably flipped through it,
Hate reading is reading too, I guess.
He probably would never admit to having read it.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the other Bowie biographies were like, I don't know if he would have read books about himself. So we didn't think that it could fit, but that was the way we could get a book on that was technically about him, was
Yeah.
like he had to have at least leafed through it.
Yeah. That's funny. I'm doing the show, so I often will interview authors of books about Bowie.
Yeah.
And so because of that, my own reading habits have changed. I read more books about Bowie than I probably would have. And so, I'm reading fewer books, from his list, or just because of the limits of time. But so speaking of limits of time, let me ask you this. You mentioned some of the books that you really did not like from the list. I did want to ask, which are some of your favorite, and the asterisks of that question, not books that you had already read that you liked, but books that you discovered from the list that really became among your favorites.
Do you want to go first, Greg?
Yeah. I wonder if you're going to say what I'm going to say, though.
Probably.
Oh, okay. I was going to say Earthly Powers.
Yeah.
By Anthony Burgess, which we read very early on, and both of us were like, "This is amazing. This whole list is going to be great." And well, it didn't exactly turn out that way, but it's a book that both of us were super surprised by, and not something that I think either of us would have read.
Yeah.
A book about a pope.
It was an intimidating one because it was big. It's one of the few, or maybe only, author who's on the list twice. So Burgess was on the list. Our very first book was Clockwork Orange, and then Earthly Powers. He wrote in his like intro, like, I don't know why I'm known for Clockwork Orange. Like, that was like an anomaly in my oeuvre. This is more like what I like. And I've thought so much about Earthly Powers since we read it, especially recently with the election of the new pope, and his brother talking about, well, he was just a guy, I grew up with. And that's a lot of what Earthly Powers is, like the human becoming a religious figure. Berlin Alexanderplatz was also one that I don't know if I would have found it had it not been on the list. And that was a number of the Weimar era Germany books. Berlin Alexanderplatz and that Before the Deluge were like surprise books that I really enjoyed and learned so much about an era that I kind of spun off from there and read like other things kind of related to the same time because I was so interested in it.
Yeah. Greg, any additions?
The next book that comes to mind is a favorite just because of how strange it is Octobriana, which was a fake Russian underground comic that was, I guess, developed by someone who was not in Russia and not in the Russian underground. But it's such a strange thing that I'm glad I got to look at it. And we actually sent it to someone, who's like, oh, I've been looking for a copy of it just, so I can complete the list. And so we mailed it to him, and he mailed it back to me with a card that said, "This was batshit crazy. Thank you." So I'm glad we got to participate in that craziness.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I haven't read any of those books that you just mentioned, so I'm going to have to track them down.
42nd Parallel also was a good one.
Oh, yeah.
Dos Passos was on my list to read, but I had not yet read. And 42nd Parallel was a great, like, historic America, experimental. It was really good.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's great. So, if you're watching this and you're looking for a good book, this show is where to go, and the website, which has, again, the whole list and then what's coming up, and that's great. So I'm just going to ask a couple final questions, two of which are silly. But the serious one is, so I kept referring to the website, which sort of telegraphs what's coming for this year. But do you have thoughts and plans for beyond this year? The further away you get from his actual list, what do you intend to do with the show?
Well, we have 56 books on the list, so I don't know how many more years that will be.
We have a few more years of it, yeah.
Yeah.
working through this one that we created in the same form
Yeah.
of like having it to start with, so we're not like, you know,
So that's
adding.
fixed. That list is fixed.
Well, we've added
Yeah.
one or
Yeah.
two.
We've made some substitutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was one substitution that we made. Um, but yeah, so we'll be working through that. That was our first thought. These were the things that we should have recommended, or we wonder why it was mentioned. He talked about this book, but it didn't make it on the list. You know, we talked about like psychic self-defense. He had talked a lot about, or but didn't make it on the list. Or the one we're starting now is The Man Who Fell to Earth. So he
Yes.
was in the film.
Yeah.
He must have read the book in
Yeah.
order to prepare for the role. So we're gonna, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's probably going to get us through next 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, about that. And we've gotten some submissions from listeners that we've added to the list. So the list could, kind of grow or change a little bit over time. So it's not a fixed point of an ending. So we have talked a bit about other things we could do. There are other book lists out there, from different musicians and authors. So we could kind of extend it in that sense too. So we're starting to kind of collect different lists, and who knows where we'll end up going with it, but that could be one way we'll go.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of viewers are going to just be happy to know that the show will go on. So, silly question. First of two silly questions. So Bowie did not address the topic of reading in too many of his songs, although every once in a while he'll have a line like "the books were found by the golden ones." But he did do a song with Tin Machine called "I Can't Read," and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that song.
We were texting about this last night.
Yeah.
I don't know. Kristianne, did you come to any conclusions on that?
Well, it was a song we picked for the Susan Jacoby episode. And I mean, it kind of goes back to the question you asked before about like, was he complicit in sort of the fast culture distraction from reading and intellectuality? And I think it was kind of a struggle at that time. It's both that and just like a struggle with connecting to your own thoughts and creativity and interior life. I think it's more just about distraction, about like so much just kind of bombarding us at all times.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
And I was thinking about that too, that sort of sense of alienation from yourself and from other people, that sort of disconnection, which maybe comes from not being able to build your interior life through things like reading, through things that take that kind of patience.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, we've come to the time in my show where I ask the same closing question I ask of everybody. And it's the most superficial possible question, which is, what is your favorite Bowie song and album?
You first, Greg.
Okay, I'm going to say Scary Monsters for both. And not just because Kristianne just got me a copy on vinyl for my birthday. So thank you again for that, Kristianne. I think that's the first Bowie record I got. Well, or at least the one that I remember hearing. And the song Scary Monsters was one of those songs where I'm like, what even is this? And it that feeling of discovering something that's really new and really different. And that sort of generative moment of like, I need to find more music like this, that's weird like this. So while there are other, I definitely go through different phases of different records, and I think like Black Star is the one that I keep coming back to just because like there's so much to it.
Yeah.
I think that's still my favorite.
Yeah. Scary Monsters is my favorite album as well.
It's just so good and weird.
Yeah.
Well, now I have to change because Scary Monsters, when I was a kid, I went into like the thrift store when you used to be able to find vinyl in thrift stores that was like nice. And Scary Monsters and pinups were like there in the record bin, and that was how I learned about Bowie. So that was like my first album, Scary Monsters. Um, but I think through the uh, through the years that we've been doing this podcast, I've actually fallen in love with Low.
Yeah.
That like the kind of minimalist, like the B-side pieces on that, I really love just sitting with it. Like it's one of those times when I just want to listen to a full album in its
Yeah.
entirety. Though weirdly, I don't know why, but my first thought was for song was always Crashing in the Same Car because I've been trying to use that for years on the podcast. Like, can we use this song? No, it doesn't really fit. Can we use this song? No, it doesn't really fit. And we finally used it for the flamethrowers. But yeah, that I've been like advocating to use that song for so long.
It took like 5 years. Yeah.
Excellent choices. Well, thank you, Kristianne Huntsberger, Greg Miller. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for your show. It's really wonderful. Again, if anybody is watching this who does not subscribe to that show, you absolutely should. The Bowie Book Club. It's really wonderful. And thank you for joining me. I want to now go and read a book.
Yay!
Yeah.
What are you gonna
This was
read?
super fun.
Well, I told you that because I'm doing this show, my reading has changed a little bit. So I'm now reading Simon Goddard's Bowie Odyssey 75.
Ah,
Just got.
Oh, wow.
I interviewed him a couple weeks ago before it was released, before 75 was released, and he just sent me a copy, autographed. So he says,
Oh, that's awesome.
"John, I'm only writing." That's the.
Oh, that's excellent.
yeah.
I just got it and I have to read it.
Cool.